France is back. Emmanuel Macron's line drawing applause in Davos. The French president was definitely playing to a friendly audience as he pitched his country and his continent to the captains of globalisation, taking part in the World Economic Forum. He also pleaded for a global compact to make growth more ethical and pointedly called on the US and China to sign a deal to regulate taxes worldwide. Do his words, though, match his deeds? What are the French president's answers to growing inequality at home? Macron's speech, the opening act in Davos for one Friday by a certain Donald J. Trump, the U.S. president, coming to the Swiss ski resort after putting America first, you might say, into proactive mode. He slapped hefty import duties this week on washing machines and solar panels. That's got China and South Korea up in arms. His Commerce Secretary hinting in Davos that this may only be the start of it. Today in the France 24 debate, we're reviewing Macron in Davos. And with us here in the studio, Poland's ambassador to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, Alessando.
Good evening.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting.
Also with us, former member of parliament. He's the current mayor of the French suburb.
I insist.
Of Maison Lafitte, Jacques Millard of the conservative Les Républicains Party.
Yes, this is true.
Thank you for being with us. And Francesco Saracino, senior economist at the OFCE think tank and who teaches at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Happy New Year.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. He's been to Davos as François Hollande's economy minister, Emmanuel Macron returning as president and telling the World Economic Forum that France is back before touting a 10-year strategy for Europe.
But let us not be naive. Today, globalization in general is going through a major crisis. And this global challenge requires, for sure, a collective effort from international organizations, states, companies, civil society, in order to find and implement solutions.
He said a lot more than that. Let's cross now to our business editor, Stephen Carroll, who is in Davos. Emmanuel Macron making a pitch for France, for Europe, and for the world.
It certainly was. It was almost a speech in three parts, as I was saying to you just a little earlier, Francois. A fairly significant chunk at the start dedicated there to his call to bring France back to, boost the attractiveness of France. And that really followed on from the summit that we had on Monday in Versailles, where he invited 140 international CEOs to hear, I suppose, the pitch to come and do business in France, and particularly to create jobs, which, of course, the main goal of all of this. It's interesting, talking to people who were at that summit in Versailles on Monday, the style was very particular. They were during the dinner that Emmanuel Macron attended. He started by speaking for 5 minutes and then took questions for 2 hours. So he was really kind of keen to get down and dirty with the CEOs. In his speech today, so we had a bit of everything, a bit of choose France, plenty on Europe, wanting to push for closer integration in Europe, and a bit of a warning to those that don't want to move for closer integration that they should get out of the way. And then this long pitch pushing for multilateralism, pushing for an international approach to tackle world problems, calling on growth as being a means and not an end to achieving equality, and also the ability to try and create more equality across genders, more economic equality across countries as well. And then just towards the end we had this, I suppose, a little bit of a pitch to try and change the international taxation system as well. It's calling on the US and China to sign up to an international deal which will cut down on tax avoidance. So a little bit of something for everyone. A particularly long speech for Davos, much longer than had been expected, and he did get a standing ovation at the end of it as well, so it was a speech very much targeted at the Davos audience.
A speech very much targeted at the Davos audience. A long speech is something that doesn't surprise Francesco Saracino.
No, I mean, since the election in May...
He likes long speeches.
Long speeches, and his targets, his target is clearly the CEOs and the
And he knew how to talk their talk. He knew how to talk their talk.
Absolutely. I mean, he absolutely in line with what they expect him to do. And I was not surprised that he was met by a standing ovation, actually. I mean, I think we'll come back to that, but I mean, there are a bunch of contradictions in what he says and what he yes.
He told his audience, France is a nation of entrepreneurs. Of course, that harks back to that old line that of George W. Bush, the French don't have a word for entrepreneur.
No, I mean, I think that in that he's perfectly right. France is a great country, a very healthy economy in spite of many problems that he also mentioned during his speech. So that part of his speech is not at all a problem for me. He is right in arguing that investing in France and making business with France is not a bad idea in today's world. I totally agree with that.
He says that France has simplified and streamlined doing business in France.
Well, I doubt it. Frankly speaking, I doubt it. Of course, he had a standing ovation in Davos because the people who were there are just in line with his kind of ideology. But in fact, to change the frame of the French economy, it will take a long time. And I think the failure of the French economy is a lack of investment. Because in, Macron's speeches and policy, there is nothing to change the level of investment. Of course, he has, changed the labor law just marginally. But it won't, because you have more flexibilities that won't create jobs. The key is investment, and this is lacking.
Foreign direct investment is
that's
up.
not enough. That's not enough. You should fancy that in France, in this world, is still, the first exporter of capital because of our fiscal policy, because people flee from France because they don't believe, maybe they will change their mind now, but we export more capital than United States for years and years. So this is the weakness of French economy, because we have a best fiscal policy to make, capital flee away.
Alexander Surde, when Macron tells his audience France is back, is he right?
Well, France is always among the leaders of the world economy and Europe, and showing the pace and also restoring the hope in the future, because in a depressive mode, nothing good will happen. So at least in this young France's president, we see the energy and hope.
Is that un-French to be optimistic?
No. I can assure no.
All right. You mentioned that there are tax policies on the work on the domestic front. It's important to mention the domestic scene because there have been changes in France to encourage more investment, and particularly by lowering the tax burden for households. However, one survey from Francesco Saracino's outfit estimates that 42% of the wealth generated by Macron's measures for 2018 will help only the top 5%. The OFCE goes further, and it says that the poorest 5% of French households will actually lose money, a little more than 0.5%, and the richest 5% of households will become even richer. He's gone in for a lot of criticism domestically for being the president of the rich.
It's partially, I think it's a well-grounded criticism. The thing is that Macron is trying to make a difficult balancing act, I think. On one side, he wants to attract capital, and I agree, there is much more than just a few tax rebates to make France attractive. And on the other, he's trying to push some other agenda, more progressive agenda, like environmental transition and so on and so forth. And so this is where the problem with his budget law comes, because all the tax rebates mostly go to the very rich and to a particular set of assets, which is physical
So how could
capital.
he have done it differently?
Well, for once, I would have probably targeted more the middle class. the problem with France is that the middle class is suffering. It's the problem with Europe, actually. And so I don't believe in trickle-down economics. So I don't believe that by making the rich richer, the economy will grow so fast and so much that everybody else will also be better off. So targeting the middle class and maybe even the so-called ecological transition, phase it out a little bit, because the cost for the lower deciles of the distribution comes from the increase in the price of tobacco and of gas. So the so-called
excise taxes.
Excise tax. So that's the problem. So a bit softer on these things that I think are overall well-grounded, and probably insist more on the middle class and less on the very rich, because I don't believe that trickle-down works. And by the way, it's interesting. He's the first in Davos, Trump will be the last in Davos, and on that they share the same view. Make the rich richer and everything will be better. Not just sure.
Of course, Stephen Carroll, in his speech, that's not what Emmanuel Macron said. In fact, he made an impassioned pitch for the middle class.
Yeah, that's right. And equality really was one of the central messages as well of President Macron's speech.
So is there a disparity then, Stephen, between what he's preaching and what he's practicing?
It depends. I mean, it's you have better economists on set who can discuss the pros and cons of cutting taxes and where tax cuts fall. He did talk about in his speech their tax strategy and the fact that they're trying to give predictability to tax systems and show where taxes will be for the next 5 years to try and give companies more predictability. We know that he's introduced a flat tax on investment or on dividends to try and encourage more investment in France, and that's something that he's trying to stimulate. And he talked about all of this in his speech as well, of trying to stimulate how you stimulate the domestic economy as best you can using innovation. As to whether the taxes are heavier on the rich or heavier on the poor, I think proportionately the tax changes that we've already had implemented have benefited the rich more at this stage. But of course that is the argument of trickle-down economics, as if you're trying to get more rich people, have people invest more money to create more jobs down the line. Whether or not it works is of course a matter of debate.
Alexander Surde?
The tax exercise is a domestic exercise, and the balance between the pressure on the president to deliver better public services, health, education, housing, which are in France entitlements. You are the country of rights. But on the other side of the equation, there is economic dynamism, and you said it depends on entrepreneurs and managers to continue investing, to also accumulating capital by retaining profits and not being taxed. So the exercise, I will not give advice to the France's president, but of course it's a domestic exercise.
Yeah. Yes, I would like to stress a kind of contradiction in his fiscal policy and budget policy. It is true, as a man from the right side of the political scene, that we advocate to suppress the ISF, that means the
wealth tax.
The wealth tax, but he did not suppress it completely. He kept it on housing. And this is kind of industry as well. So I don't see that. But in the meantime, he has been suppressing, this €5 help for the students. Politically, this is in contradiction, and this is a mistake that he made. And in the meantime, as well, as he says, he, impose a new consumption tax, what we call the CSG, that means this tax on consumption for everyone, and especially for the pensioner. So he has levied about 20 billion of euros on consumption. So this is in a kind of contradiction every time. So he has to choose, and as has been said, it's very important to help the families, the middle classes, those who create jobs, those who create add value in the economy, and not only the top, the top wealth classes, because those, they play the world economy and they don't play the domestic economy.
But I just want to get back to that survey, and one of the side issues that we're not really talking about too much is we have what's a main issue is this is a year when there's growth worldwide, better than expected growth here in Europe, but it's not benefiting everyone the same way. Case in point, investment banker Simon French sent out this tweet early this morning. The split personality of the UK labour market in two charts, he says. Employment keeps hitting new highs. Private sector wages, though, falling steadily for a decade, now below the levels they were at in 2006. That story in the UK can be told in many countries.
My own country, Italy. In Italy, everybody was very proud because we had employment going back to the 2008 level a few months back in September. And then if you look at the GDP is still 6.5% lower than it was. So I don't want to talk about Italy.
Especially in Italy.
So the thing is that we create jobs, but these jobs are precarious, very often part-time jobs, and with a very strong reduction of labor protection, which goes exactly against this desire to create stability for the middle class, which is what sustains growth. I think, if I can, maybe we can come back later to that. I think that what Macron has in mind, his team, not him just, of course, is to go the German way. So do everything to increase competitiveness of your country, even if that comes to the detriment of the strength of domestic demand. And so basically hope that the rest of the world will pull you out of the recession and will pull you into decent growth. That's a very dangerous strategy, though, because if everybody does that, who will buy the more competitive goods? If we try to be more competitive, and France tries to be, and Germany tries to be more competitive, and Italy and the UK, in the end, will all remain at the same relative place, and everybody will be losing. So that is where I think it's very dangerous, this strategy.
Well, we're going to pick up on that point because it's an important one. Competitiveness when it comes to the market, to taxes. When we come back, you're watching the France 24 debate.
Reporters Plus, presented by Mark Owen.
In northern Iraq on the Syrian border, Nineveh province is close to the end of the Battle of the Desert. The Shiite elite battalion is on the front line.
مو بس شرط الشيعة أو السنة أو المسيح أو أي إنسان واجب عليه نحمي أي إنسان الله خلقه بهذه الأرض واجب عليه نحمي نخليه يعيش بأمان وسلام.
Their goal now is to finish the bitter 3-year war against the Islamic State organization and prepare for the aftermath, which will be no less difficult.
Reporters Plus on France 24 and France24.com.
Eye on Africa, presented by Georgia Calvin-Smith.
Africa News, and your eyes on Africa. And bringing you the latest from across the continent.
Eye on Africa on France 24 and France24.com. Special event.
It's a blockbuster year in Davos. Donald Trump is expected to be the first US president in almost 20 years to come here, while France's Emmanuel Macron is also keen to impress the global elite.
The world economy is powering ahead, but inequality, climate change and technology are leaving many behind. Plenty for business and political leaders to discuss.
Join us all this week for full coverage on France 24.
Watch events unfold on France 24 and France24.com.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the other stories we're following for you in the newsroom, and we're waiting on that verdict out of Porto Alegre in Brazil. Appeals court judge is expected to confirm the corruption sentence for Brazil's former president, the frontrunner next October's election. Lula has vowed to fight on. Save the Children suspends operations in Afghanistan after the storming of the UK charity's offices in Jalalabad. The attack claimed by ISIS, at least 4 killed. Unwitting fixer or accessory to the Paris attacks. The first trial linked to the 2015 terror operation opens in the French capital. We'll tell you about Jawad. And floodwaters continue to rise in Paris, closing riverside rail stations and a lower level of the Louvre Museum. The Seine expected to peak on Sunday. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're speaking after Emmanuel Macron and ahead of Donald Trump on Friday at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And with us for part two of our discussion from Davos, he's the former number 2 at the World Bank, Bertrand Badret, CEO and founder of the investment firm Blue Like an Orange Sustainable Capital. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
We also want to welcome back here to the studios Poland's ambassador to the OECD, Alessando, Jacques Millard, mayor of the Paris suburb of Maison-Lafitte, former member of
Capital
Parliament.
is Maison-Lafitte. Paris is the suburbs.
I see. Okay. The record set straight there. And with us as well, Francesco Saracino, senior economist at the OFCE and who teaches at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Before heading to Davos, by the way, Emmanuel Macron hosted 140 business leaders at the Palace of Versailles. They included the bosses of Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Alibaba. Bertrand Badret, it's interesting because Macron wooing them, wining and dining in an incredible location, and then in the speech that we heard a short while ago, complaining about the unbridled tax optimization and calling for a world regulation of how the digital giants are taxed. How far is he going to get with that?
Yes, I think it's exactly the point, and I think he was honest with that point, because he said on the one hand, like others, I want to attract them and I'm willing to get their jobs and to have them on the ground and help us. On the other hand, we must recognize that there is issues. He really said, you know, it's very difficult for me to promote the startups in France where they are paying taxes, etc., to compete with the big guys coming from overseas which are not paying taxes. So this is part of the dilemmas that are on the table. I think the point is it's good to start by putting this on the table. I was not expecting a definitive answer today, but I think to tell things is important, to recognize the facts, to stop keeping the veil on this issue is extremely important.
He invited the United States and China to sign a global tax compact. Is that going to happen?
Well, I mean, if you don't ask, you never see things happen. It's true that it's extremely challenging. It's true that if you don't put on board, I mean, the two giants, which are China and the US, the two largest economy on earth, and given the US, the most global economy, given the number of large multinationals you have there, you will not get anywhere. The truth is that there is a basis for discussion. I mean, the G20, and as far as I know, the US are member of the G20, so is China and France and others, has worked with the OECD on, working on what they call base erosion and profit shifting, which is really addressing this tax issue, which is really the weak point of the global, not compact, but the global contract that we need to redesign to make globalization something a little bit more attractive than it is today.
Alessando Surde, we've had the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers. Public opinion is mobilized on this issue. Do you feel as though there could be a change, or is it going to be each nation for its own? You were saying in part one of our discussion now, tax is a domestic issue. You can't tell other countries what to do.
Not exactly. There are overlaps between domestic and foreign issues. And there is an initiative fueled by Secretary General of OECD, Angel Gurria, and the OECD, which is exactly this BEPS arrangement signed last year in July. And countries are ratifying building a sophisticated system for exchange of information about taxes, which will strengthen, the filtering effect of domestic tax services. So you can't park your profits abroad without being noticed.
You're feeling the change already?
Many countries signed. Poland ratified quite recently. And there will be a progress thanks to collaboration between nations.
Francesco Saracino?
Very quickly, I mean, before looking at China and the US, I would look at Europe. tax competition is one of the big scandals of the European Union so far. Let's not forget that the Commission is trying to get Apple to pay taxes to Ireland, and Ireland, not Apple, is challenging the decision of the Commission because Ireland wants to use its own tax system exactly with the idea that taxes are a domestic issue and Europe should have nothing to say about it. So I think the first step, which I think it's very important what Macron is doing, and I totally agree that putting that on the table in Davos is very important, but we first need to build consensus in Europe for stopping to use tax policies as tool for competition.
Bertrand Badret, is it possible to build a European consensus when it comes to taxes?
No, I mean, tax is really at the heart of the democratic model. I mean, we all know that the first parliament was established to agree to tax. Representation is a counterparty to taxation. And that's a big issue we are facing with globalization because there is no such thing as a global representation. And I had the privilege to work 14 years ago on what was called in France the Chirac tax, the tax on plane tickets. And the vision behind this was you have to have something which goes hand in hand with globalization. We have to find ways to tax globalization in a way. So it's really part of this social contract. If we are incapable of addressing this, I mean, it's going to be a huge challenge, and population will rightly resist. And
Bertrand Badret, on that point, we heard the U.S. Secretary of Finance at Davos deny today that with the new tax break policy in the U.S., there's a race to the bottom when it comes to corporate tax. Do you agree with Steve Mnuchin?
No, but I think these issues takes time. Let me draw a parallel. I mean, when the first people mentioned debt cancellation in the early 80s, it was an horror. People say, oh, you can't cancel debt. People have to pay or to restructure. And then 40 years later, it's becoming mainstream. Taxation is even more sensitive than debt cancellation. So it's good to discuss this. Again, if we get there in 10, 20 or 30 years, it's going to be great. It will take time, but we have to start somewhere. And I think it's extremely impressive to have a strong voice, like the voice of Emmanuel Macron here, to tell this and say we have to address this. If we don't address this, we have an issue. And we are all collectively responsible in this room. So it starts in Europe. And then we have to engage with the rest of the world, and namely, in particular, the US and China. That's absolutely critical.
Jacques Niard, ahead of Donald Trump's speech on Friday, who's going to win this argument?
Well, first of all, I think we are changing a world in terms of how do we judge all those big companies who are worldwide. And I do believe that now they will come to an end in terms of taxes, because in fact, even in France, if we pass a law to tax where is the add value and where they should pay tax, I think we can achieve it, because they are not going to, to really don't come anymore to France because they have to make business in France. So they will pay tax. This is a question of political will as well as a good law to tax them. And I think there is a big change now in the world opinion on those companies who try to escape their taxes. And I think that time is come, because Macron is not the first one to speak about that. We have started in the OECD already a lot of works to try to have, common agreement on tax. Secondly, there has been a lot of work on the G20 also to try to find a way. So I think that the states today are at the level to come again in this globalization and to stop all
with
this,
or without Donald Trump?
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because Europe as such or France or Germany are still big states, and those companies cannot ignore those states as commercial target. So they will have to abide the French law, the German law, and the European laws. This is a question of political will.
As Monsieur Le Maire has said, it's also technical and legal difficulty in designing proper taxation for digital operations, because how you can register the operation and how you can trace the money which flows But I think that rightly several European nations acting together can capture the part of profits which are made in Europe.
Because their economies are so big that...
Not only that, it's question of legal, definition. If we say, I'm sorry, when you sell something through these computers to a French consumer, then this should be short French law, full stop. I think, you should not enter their ideology. You have to impose your sovereignty.
All right, sovereignty here in Europe when it comes to this issue. Of course, there's another issue which we need to broach, which is trade. And we had earlier this week the United States announcing 20% tariffs on South Korean and Chinese goods, in particular solar panels and washing machines in that instance. Regarding those import tariffs that have anchored Beijing and Seoul, Donald Trump's Commerce Secretary in Davos telling reporters trade wars are fought every day. Wilbur Ross adding, unfortunately, every single day there are various parties trying to violate the rules and trying to take unfair advantage of things. The difference is that U.S. troops are now coming to the rampart. Bertrand Badret, your reaction to Wilbur Ross's remarks?
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
I was saying your reaction when Wilbur Ross says when it comes to imposing tariffs on unfair advantages in imports and exports, the U.S. is now coming to the rampart.
Yeah, I mean, no, that's, again, I'm based in Washington, so I'm witnessing all these elements and all these changes firsthand. I'm very worried, actually. If you allow me to borrow a quote from David Lipton, who is a deputy to Christine Lagarde, he said, in today's world, unfortunately, everybody wants to register his car in Ohio. Ohio meaning own house in order, America first to say. So everybody wants to say, I know my house better, I want to protect my house, I want to erect tariffs, I want to design my own tax system, blah, blah, blah. And this is totally, this is a total collective failure to go in that direction. But this is what is happening. And we have to move from Ohio to what he says California. And why California? Because California starts with CA, like collective action. So we are on the verge of moving all to Ohio, where we should all move to California. And this is happening as we speak. So it's important to have strong voices to resist that. It's not enough, but it's a good beginning. So I think we should really, even if we disagree on the modalities, we should really agree on the fact that these things are put on the table. And as citizens, we should put pressure on our government, as investors, as consumers, as people saving money. We should really put pressure on our government to make this happen. Because if not, I think we are ahead of a big, big, big problem.
Ahead of a big problem? How much of a big problem? What are you expecting Donald Trump to say on Friday in Davos?
Well, I think the big problem is exactly if we are incapable of kind of reconvening together and address, I mean, even if it takes time, the questions of taxing, I mean, the digital economy, as you mentioned, of really addressing what's left of the tax havens, for instance, I mean, addressing the issues that are really global, like climate and so on and so forth, then we will see people which feel really empowered continue to vote the way they've been voting in certain countries, and then we will have a dislocating world. I mean, I'm happy that 10 years after the crisis, we are not in May 1940, so we are not in a pre-World War situation. So far, we have navigated the crisis relatively well, but it could start to turn a little bit more bad, and that's what I want to avoid, and that's why it's important that the forums which are a little bit more to talk shop, like the G20, really move into action and really address the concern of the people.
Alexander Surde, last summer, Donald Trump came to Europe. In your country, Poland, he got a very warm reception. Poles liked his message.
Well, Poland and the United States have a long history of friendship, so he was perceived in the line of all American presidents telling nice words about Poland.
Saying nice words about Poland, but there is this, at the same time, as we've seen Warsaw fence politically with Brussels, there is this sort of reticence when it comes to things that are multilateral and done at a continent-wide level.
Well, in Poland, we say about Polish economy that it's an open economy and solidarity-guided domestic policies. So both our economy is open and increasingly our companies that grow organically, they are expanding abroad. So the Prime Minister and other political class members from the ruling party, they are knowing that for Poland,
it's a nationalist government in Poland. Would you say that
it's just reaffirming some principles of national identity, but calling this in a negative way? I think that.
No, but would you say Poles are closer to Macron's vision of what Europe is, or more aligned with Donald Trump when it comes to the relationship between states?
We are discussing the vision of Europe with France and French politicians, and I think that we are in line with those that want Europe to continue as a prosperous continent, and with Poland, with its place among European nations. And
Francesco Saracino, we heard in his speech Macron make this call for a 10-year plan for Europe, which he says he wants to see to empower Europe more. He wants this plan out by the end of this year. Ahead of the Italian elections, what would you like to see in terms of European ambition and vis-a-vis this whole issue of do countries go it alone when it comes to things like trade and multilateralism?
Well, I think, I side with Emmanuel Macron on the issue of multilateralism. Of course, the answer to the problems posed by globalization is not tariffs, is not protection, because this is what led the world in a couple of occasions in the past on the brink of war. It's what was said before. So I think that the answer to unfair competition, which exists, is not protection, is better regulation. And that you can only obtain if you act multilaterally. And coming to the European project, there are some things I like in the idea of Macron. Macron wants to complete the European Monetary Union in a way that, in some sense, I think is reasonable and might protect us from because the next crisis will hit, and avoid that.
And he really talked about a two-speed Europe in that speech, saying that we need to, as he put it, have an avant-garde code for we need a two-speed Europe.
Well, when it comes to the euro, this is problematic because we share the same currency. So I don't see how you can have some countries, for example, sharing a budget and some others not sharing a budget, for example. So I think this is more a rhetorical thing than a real plan. He needs to get at least the 19 countries of Eurozone on board for that. So 1 year, I think, is a very short time frame for that. We don't even know when the next German government will be operational. So that is not very realistic. But I insist on what we said in the first part. You cannot, while saying that you need more cohesive and more solidarity in Europe, at the same time embrace the same strategies other countries have been using, like competitive devaluation, trying to steal, quote-unquote, market shares from other countries. This is not what cooperation is. So I think the speech is very good, the actions a bit less.
Bertrand Badret?
Oui. Sorry, yes.
Do you agree with Francesco Saracino?
Yeah, I think this is actually I was in the room today and I listened to people. So on the one hand, I think most people in the room, and it's not a surprise, were really thrilled by what was said, and say it's important, as I said in my previous comments, to tell things, to designate things, to use the right words, etc. But now, as we all know, it's going to be difficult to move into action. So it's going to require a big effort from France, but not France alone, with everybody. And I think it's going to be very important to follow up on implementation action. I know the president likes to basically have a timetable, a table where you record what's progressing, etc. It's a real challenge. I think we should not underestimate the importance of this challenge. Being French and living in the US, I see the tensions in the world today. I mean, you have, to be very simplistic, a Chinese model, a US or maybe an Anglo-Saxon model, and in the middle, Europe has to find its way. And I think it's important not only for Europe, for the prosperous continent that my Polish colleague mentioned, but also for a big part of the world to define a model which really is a fair model, promoting sustainable development, using finance as an appropriate tool. Having technology benefiting all and not just a handful of companies and so on and so forth. This is a real challenge, not only just for just people around the microphone tonight, but maybe for the world. We are at a crossroads, and we should not underestimate that crossroads.
Jacques Millard?
Well, first of all, I think we have to put things as they are. We live in an interdependent world. So it means that if you go further and too far on question of protectionism, and you don't want to have you tax because you don't want them to be imported, the goods to be imported, there will be limits very quickly, because reciprocity is one of the rules of this interdependent world. That's the first point. So I am not afraid of Mr. Trump, saying I'm going to protect and to avoid too much import in the US. Secondly, on the question of the European, let's say, dream of Mr. Macron, I say dream. What is being said, is absolutely nonsense when you look at the European states today. He wants federalism. Nobody wants federalism. So we have to find a new kind of Europe in which, of course, we need cooperation. We need Europe. We need to save up the single market. But I don't think that we are going to go further on, and it will take time to go on, because the Germans don't want to pay. This is full stop. The Germans don't want to pay for the weak. And, this is the hardcore of the Eurozone. So I think that we have to be very pragmatical. And what I reproach to Macron, that he's launching so many things, that he won't be able to manage them, to master them, because he speaks too much. He says too many things. He's trying to suggest too many things, but the world is not the new world. It's still the whole world.
Alexander Surde, you agree? Macron wants a more federal Europe, but the Germans don't want to pay. Case closed.
It's a logic of the functioning of the European Monetary Union that it creates such stringent conditions for weaker economies that on this background the German economy gains, but the counterpart was mentioned by you. But for now, I think that the biggest thing we can do is stabilize our expectations and don't jump either in the destruction of, pessimism or some unreliable hope.
Bertrand Badret, let me ask you about the atmosphere at Davos in that respect. A year ago, Trump was just being inaugurated. Many of those who embrace globalization where you are were reeling. Yep. The one who was the big champion at the time of globalization was China's president, Xi Jinping. This year, he's got competitors. We heard a speech from Narendra Modi. We've got Emmanuel Macron's speech today. What's the mood like when it comes to this battle of titans that's going on over globalization?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we're at a moment where we have a feeling that things are going better, that 10 years into the crisis, growth is back, the financial markets are doing extremely well. So there is a tendency to be a little bit complacent and say, oh, we are back to some form of normality. And that's why I really appreciated. So maybe Jacques Millard said Emmanuel Macron speaks a lot. I think it's important to tell things those days. And I'm glad that at least he mentioned loud and clear that we cannot be complacent, that it's not because things are doing a little better, that we have a little bit of economic growth, that we have addressed the problems that were raised over the last 20 years, be it the European problems, the financial problems, the refugee crisis, etc. So we really have to find a way forward. And that's really the kind of in the back of people's mind here. I mean, the general mood is pretty optimistic and I would say a little bit complacent. I'm afraid, if you remember the infamous words from Chuck Prince, as long as there is music, I will dance. I'm afraid we will put back music and people are willing to dance again, which makes me a little nervous.
Also, you see? On the Titanic also you have music. There is one thing I would like to ask to Bertrand, because he is a much better economist than I am. This is this question of bubbles we have now on the markets. And I think this is very dangerous. I do believe that we are dancing on a volcano.
Yeah, how long will the music last?
That's it.
Yeah. There's a question I'm often asked when I discuss, will there be another crisis? And I say, yes, of course, there is always another crisis. I don't know when, I don't know the topic, I might have some ideas. There will be a crisis. Are we getting ready for the next crisis, or are we just willing to enjoy the nice moment we are enjoying today? I think we have to have eyes wide open, and that's really what I liked with the speech of Emmanuel Macron. He said we have to address the globalization problem, the globalization malaise, because it's real.
I agree. And when that crisis comes, France 24 will be there. Bertrand Badré, I want to thank you for joining us from the World Economic Forum in Davos. I want to thank Francesco Saracino, Alexander Serde, Jacques Millard. Thank you for joining us.